welcome to another Sneak Peek Saturday at the Alameda Free Library. My name is Jenny, and today we are going to read some nonfiction. The title of this book is Mud Sweeter Than Honey, Voices of Communist Albania, and it has been written by Margo Rejmer, translated from the Polish by Zosia Krasodomska-Jones and Antonia Lloyd-Jones. This is what the title looks like. It's in our news section. Like always, I'm going to read you the inside of the flap and then we're gonna get started. For nearly half a century, Albania was held captive by one man, a cruel dictator with a deep paranoid streak. Enver Hoxha sealed the country's border, severed alliances, and enacted a totalitarian regime of gulags and purges. Many thousands suffered and died in silence, a silence that lingers today. Decades after Hoxha's death, his victims are still waiting for justice. In Mud Sweeter Than Honey, Albanians break the silence. Margo Rejmer spent years in Albania interviewing survivors of Hoxha's rule, arranging their voices into a chorus that bears witness to how ordinary people lived and died. We are immersed in the desperate border crossings, prison revolts, and everyday struggles to make a living. We meet a writer who finds secret freedom in a tiny village library of banned books overlooked by censors. We meet a man who still only speaks in a whisper, afraid of being overheard. While Albanians endured surveillance, imprisonment, and torture under Hoxha, they also read books and fell in love, raised families, and found ways to survive. In the tradition of Svetlana Alexievich, Mud Sweeter Than Honey is the most intimate portrait available in English of this little understood part of Europe. Okay. So it has a map of Albania right here that you can reference while you're reading the book. And it also has a timeline of all sorts of events that happened. Not just with the war, also before. So why don't we get started with the introduction? The introduction is by Tony Barber. At the state funeral for Enver Hoxha in April 1985, the dictator's body was buried next to the Mother Albania monument in Tirana's cemetery of the martyrs of the nation. A red marble slab with the inscription Enver Hoxha 1908 to 1985 was placed over the coffin. Ramiz Alia, Hoxha's successor as Communist Party leader, solemnly told the mourners, "There should be no date of death on this marble stone. There is just one date for Enver Hoxha, his date of birth, and that is how it will always be. There is no death for him. Enver Hoxha is immortal." Intended as a prophecy and doubtless as a warning to the Albanian people that Hoxha's repressive apparatus of power would outlast the tyrant himself, Alia's words proved mercifully off the mark. Less than 6 years after the funeral rites, a crowd tore down the bronze statue of Hoxha that towered over Skanderberg Square, Tirana's main plaza. In May 1992, Hoxha's remains were transferred from their grand resting place to Tirana's plain municipal cemetery. A little later than other countries in East Central Europe, but not a moment too soon for most Albanians, the nation was embarking on a rocky journey to political pluralism, civic freedoms, a market-based economy, and integration with the outside world that continues to this day. Despite the undeniable progress made over the past 3 decades, the legacy of Hoxha lingers on. It could hardly be otherwise, given that the tyrant had ruled by the time of his death for 41 of the 73 years that had elapsed since Albania claimed its independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1912. Yet the desire among political elites, and ordinary citizens alike look to Albania's future rather than its past is understandably strong. On a visit to Tirana in 2015, I had dinner with Edi Rama, who had been elected Albania's prime minister 2 years earlier. Recalling the brutality, desolation, and at times somewhat surreal quality of Hoxha's dictatorship, Rama told me, "I've stopped telling my son about those times because he looks at me as if I'm crazy." Much sweeter than honey serves as an essential reminder that to move on from a painful national past should never mean to forget it or brush it aside. This is as true for Western countries with complicated legacies of imperialism, racial injustice, and lapses from democracy, as it is for former communist societies once held in the grip of fear and silence. It is important for the voices of victims of Albanian communism to be heard, writes Margo Rejmer. For many Albanians, the suffering of the past is so vivid that it feels as if it only ended yesterday. They're hurt by the failure to settle accounts or to provide compensation, and by the feeling that in today's Albania no one cares about the criminality of the old system. Measured against other communist regimes that emerged in East Central Europe around the end of the Second World War, Hoxha's dictatorship stands out as one of the most unrelentingly cruel. With the passage of time, it also became the one that was most cut off by its own choice from the rest of the world. In these respects, it bore a closer resemblance to Kim Il-sung's North Korea than to Hungary under Janos Kara or to Poland, Rejmer's native country, under Władysław Gomułka and Edward Gierek. Even Bulgaria, under Todor Zhivkov, was more open. The persuasive, intimidating presence of the Sigurimi security police in Albanian life was comparable to that of the Stasi in Erich Honecker's East Germany and the Secretariat in Nicolae Ceausescu, Romania. But the truly distinctive feature of Hoxha's tyranny was that, in contrast to its counterparts in East Central Europe and, for that matter, the Soviet Union, the Albanian regime displayed ruthlessness, paranoia, and regular murderous instincts in a manner that scarcely changed at all from 1944 to 1985. Gentian Skurti, an artist, tells Rejmer that in the communist era you felt as if you were being raped on a daily basis. Stalinism exacted a heavy toll across the communist world in the late 1940s and early 1950s in the form of executions, torture, imprisonment, purges, and general suffering. But after Joseph Stalin's death in 1953, and even more so after the violent suppression of the 1956 Budapest uprising, the one-party regimes of East Central Europe settled into a less ferocious style of rule. For sure, the Prague Spring liberalization ended with a Warsaw Pact invasion in 1968. Poland's solidarity movement was suppressed under martial law in 1981, and repression under Ceausescu intensified in Romania throughout the 1980s. Yet the era of high Stalinism had ended decades earlier. Not so in Albania. Hoxha, the son of an imam from the southern town of Gjirokastea, idolized Stalin, the seminary student from Gori in Georgia. Or perhaps it is more accurate to say that Hoxha admired not so much Stalin himself as the methods of consolidating a dictatorship, including the leader's personality cult and the liquidation of all rivals, real and imagined, that Stalin perfected. In 1945, Hoxha ordered the execution of Bari Omari, his brother-in-law and a former Albanian foreign minister, in an unmistakable signal that he would spare no one, not even his sister's husband, as he imposed communism on his country. 3 decades later, the same fate befell Bekir Baluko, Hoxha's long-serving defense minister. In 1981, Mehmet Zehu, Hoxha's prime minister and closest associate of all, fell foul of the dictator and committed suicide. Bashkim Shehu, Mehmet's son, recounts to Rejmer how this episode resulted in prison terms and internal exile for other members of the Shehu family. Is it possible to construct any sort of defense for the abominations of Hoxha's rule? Bernd Fischer, one of the world's leading scholars of Albanian communism, writes. Views of Hoxha's impact vary rather widely, but most historians suggest that he had some important achievements to his credit. These are said to include improvements in the status of women in Albania's deeply conservative post-Second World War society, a better education system, reduced rivalries between the country's northern and southern regions, and even a modicum of economic well-being, achieved, to be sure, from a very low starting point. Besides these accomplishments, Hoxha in some ways completed the construction of the Albanian nation-state that had begun in the interwar era under King Zog, but was thrown drastically off course by the Italian invasion and de facto annexation of Albania in 1939 and the country's occupation by the Nazis in 1943 and 1944. In contrast to the experience of all countries in East Central Europe except Yugoslavia, the Albanian communist takeover was not Soviet-led but homegrown, though the British helped Hoxha's partisans with supplies of weapons. Then, during his 4 decades in power, Hoxha preserved Albania's independence against what torrents of state propaganda depicted at various times as the malevolent designs of Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, and China, not to mention Western imperialism. For a European state, it was an unusual form of independence perched on the edges of the international system. As East-West detente gathered pace in the era of Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev, the Helsinki Final Act of 1975 was signed by 35 countries, including the United States, Canada, the Soviet Union, and all European states, except Albania. As Rejmer reminds us, Albania was a self-styled paradise held together by barbed wire and dotted with labor camps, a small country of bunkers, blockades, and barricades. In Much Sweeter Than Honey, a few of Rejmer's interviewees either deny the horror of conditions under Hoxha or, more often, express the despairing view that inequality, poverty, corruption, and political turbulence in the post-communist era make it difficult to discern the benefits of democracy. But a different insight comes from the writer Fatos Lubonia, who observes, when freedom came, the Albanians were like children who didn't know what responsibility was. Building a politically stable, economically flourishing society founded on the rule of law has proved to be a formidable task in many post-communist countries, but in few more so than in Albania, where knowledge of the outside world was so restricted that a person might tremble in fear that a can of Coca-Cola was a small foreign-made bomb. Yet the powerful of chilling stories in Much Sweeter Than Honey attest to the truth that even a regime as atrocious as Hoxha's cannot triumph in the long run over the irrepressible human yearning for freedom and dignity. In one of the most moving passages of Rejmer's book, Ridwan Dibra, a writer and college lecturer, tells the author, "The system wasn't capable of destroying everyday beauty, and that was our salvation. Beauty always found a way around the system." Okay, let me just take a sip here. Okay. Let's start with Part 1, Children of the Dictator. Once upon a time, paradise was created in the most perfect socialist country in the world, where everything belonged to everyone and nothing belonged to anyone. Where everyone knew how to read and write, but they could only write what the authorities endorsed, and they could only read what the authorities approved. Where electricity, buses, and propaganda reached every village, but ordinary citizens weren't entitled to a car or an opinion of their own. Where everyone could rely on free healthcare, but people sometimes vanished without a trace. Where mass education was a priority, but every few years purges were carried out among the elite. Where everyone was entitled to celebrate progress and cheer at public parades, but telling a joke meant challenging fate and the authorities. For that reason, the citizens were advised to feel enthusiastic and happy, because complaints and stupid jokes, in other words, agitation and propaganda, carried the threat of anything from 6 months to 10 years in prison. But there were no political prisons in paradise, only re-education camps, designed to alter the consciousness of enemies of the people with the aid of prescribed literature, torture, and penal hard labor. In paradise, everyone was equal, but people were divided into better and worse types. Those with a good family background who led an upright life, and those with a bad one who were oppressed from birth. The good had to keep company with the good, and the bad with the bad, sharing their suffering. The good could become bad at any moment. The bad generally remained the worst until death. The authorities held the life of every citizen in their grip and decided who would go to university and who would work on a cooperative farm, who would become an architect and who a bricklayer, who would be a human and who would be a wreck, who would prosper, who would languish, and who would have their life stolen from them. The authorities controlled ambitions and cut them down to size, so people eventually taught themselves not to have ambitions. In 1967, God was formally declared dead, or rather, never to have existed. and consequently all religions were officially feudal. From then on, the only religion was to be socialism and a common faith in the power of the new man. From 1978 onward, this paradise on earth stopped looking to other countries for support. It stopped owing them anything or wanting their help. It had no inflation, no unemployment, no loans, and no debts. It was self-sufficient. Its borders were marked out on all sides by barbed wire. Anyone who tried to cross them was to be shot without warning. Those who lived according to the rules of paradise believed they were the happiest people in the world. In fact, as they fell asleep at night, some of them did wonder what freedom was, but others were sure they wanted for nothing. The authorities gave them food, shelter, education, and work, so the citizens had nothing to worry about. They merely had to mind what they said, did, and thought. From 1976, their paradise on earth was called the People's Socialist Republic of Albania. Its only rightful god was Supreme Comrade Enver Hoxha. This is where I am gonna start. Where I'm going to stop, actually. Again, this book is called Much Sweeter Than Honey. You can find it in our non-fiction news section if you would like to read this. I hope you enjoyed this, and I see you again in 2 weeks. Bye.